Hello, this is Domenico with Easynomics, and we're going to continue our discussion of monopoly and evaluating it and connecting additional models from microeconomics to monopoly in our evaluation. In our previous video, which you see here, and it will be linked in the video notes below, we applied the real-world example of the real-world example of Boeing as a U.S. aircraft manufacturer that has monopoly power in the United States, but in the world market, it competes with its European rival Airbus, and so it operates in a duopoly in the world market. We graphed it, we analyzed it, which you can see again in that previous video, will be linked below. We highlighted how monopolies are allocatively and productively inefficient, and then we also connected to negative production. So on a paper exam, particularly paper 1, and even in a paper 2, when you're in the evaluation, you can demonstrate your knowledge to the IB evaluator by drawing in additional models. So here we're connecting Boeing and its abuse of its market power and its drive for profit maximization and reducing costs on average by cutting on safety standards, and that leading to the overallocation of resources to the production of defective aircraft to society, and that being a negative production externality, where we can see in the free market, the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal social benefit in the form of, in its worst case scenario, airplane crashes. And I think over 300 people were killed in 2 instances, which I'll show in a moment on Wikipedia. In addition, the grounding of the Boeing 737 by government regulators led to the airline industry being unable to use that aircraft and thus losing revenue in their ability to provide service of transporting goods and people from place to place. This video is going to again link monopoly to another model we can use, which is asymmetric information. So we can link it to negative production, in this case with Boeing. We can also link it to positive production. There's a previous video about Google investing in research and development, and that could be a form of positive production. And in this video, we're going to link it to asymmetric information, again using the example of Boeing. For some context, Boeing Company, it's an American multinational corporation. It designs, manufactures, it sells airplanes, rotorcraft, rockets, satellites, and missiles. It's based in the United States. And in 2021, according to Wikipedia, it says here Boeing recorded $62.3 billion in sales. And it is ranked 54th on the Fortune 500 list and ranked 121st on the Fortune Globe 500 list. In reference to these crashes, and again, we can use this for our asymmetric information model, Boeing 737 MAX, this particular model, was defective. And in 2018 and 2019, there were 2 separate airplane crashes, leaving 346 people dead, no survivors. This occurred, I believe, on Ethiopia Airlines and another airline. And 387 aircraft were grounded. So for the airline industry that are unable to use those aircraft to provide their service, so that's a negative impact to them. And in 2022, there was a Netflix documentary highlighting how Boeing's corporate merger with McDonnell Douglas led to the crashes through the disintegration of workplace morale. So within that workplace, negative production, workers and people on the assembly line trying to voice their concerns, and those concerns not being heard or ignored, and leading to the production of these defective aircraft. On the assembly line, and as this investigation continues, we're seeing that workers within Boeing were aware of this. They were trying to voice their concerns about the defectiveness of these aircrafts, but it was ignored. And so Boeing, as a producer, has this information, whereas society and the consumer, the airline industry consuming these airlines, do not have this information. So there we can link it to asymmetric information. And I'll get to that in a moment. So let's get to our model and link it to asymmetric information. So again, on the left side here, we have our illustration of Boeing as a monopoly. I'm not going to graph and analyze this again. And we connected it to graph B, Boeing 737 MAX as a negative production externality. Now we're going to change this and make it into asymmetric information. All right. And I'll label this graph C. So it's going to be separate from graph B here, where we're linking it to negative production. All right. And then we're going to just define what is asymmetric information. And then we'll just graph and analyze this, and then we'll be done with this particular video. Okay. And let's just quickly fix our axes so that we're ready to go. Okay. So asymmetric information. And this is for higher level students. You're responsible for being able to define and explain this. Asymmetric information is a market failure, a form of a market failure. And we want to remember that a market failure is either an over or under allocation of resources. Market failure is where we have maybe an over allocation of resources to the production of a particular good or service. So that in that case, we would have the marginal social cost being greater than the marginal social benefit. We're producing more than what is desired by society, or it could also be an under allocation of resources to production of a particular good or service. And in that under allocation, we'd have the scenario of not providing enough compared to what is desired by society, where the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal social cost. So asymmetric information can lead to a scenario where we're either producing too much, over allocation, or not enough, under allocation. In this case, with Boeing producing the 737 MAX, here we have an over allocation. We're producing more of these defective aircraft than what is desired by society. So asymmetric information leads to the scenario of market failure. But what does it mean? All right, asymmetric information is a situation in an economic transaction where one party, a buyer, seller, or we'll say an economic agent, a situation in an economic transaction where a buyer or seller has more information let's say about a particular good or service, more information about a particular good or service within the transaction than the other person. Buyer or seller has more information about the good or service than the other economic agent. Okay. So in this case, we're talking about Boeing knowingly selling defective aircraft, the 737 MAX, to airline firms, and thus they are not providing; they're hiding that information. So they're at an advantage. They are the producer selling to the consumer, the airline industry. The airline industry that's buying these aircraft are at a disadvantage because they do not know about the defects of the aircraft. So that's an asymmetric scenario. Okay, so let's go ahead and illustrate this. To not be confused with our previous video, I'm going to label this as graph C. Again, it's going to be Boeing 737 MAX, but we're illustrating an asymmetric information example. Okay, where the consumer parentheses the airline industry how come I can't, there we go. The airline industry consuming the 737 MAX has less information that's my son there, he's sitting next to me, has less information than Boeing. Okay, so that's going to be our model. And the model's relatively simple to draw as an example of asymmetric information where the consumer is at a disadvantage. So we're going to illustrate our supply curve. I'll call this S1 equal to the marginal social cost. All right. Then we're going to have a downward sloping demand curve. Demand, now let me make a little bit more space here so I can write. Here we're going to have demand equal to marginal private benefit. And that marginal private benefit is, in brackets, going to be with asymmetric information. Asymmetric info. Okay. So the consumer, again, is the airline industry. The airline industry is consuming these defective aircraft, Boeing 737X, as a defective aircraft. And the airline industry does not know this. Okay. They're buying this in good faith. They're trusting that Boeing is producing a quality product, and they're also trusting that the government regulators, the FAA, is also monitoring these aircraft and approving them as safe for society. So, based on that good faith, the airline industry is buying these aircraft. Okay, so that takes us to a free market equilibrium. So we're going to mark those 2 points. So we'll have price in the free market. I'll label this PM. M for free market, price in the free market, and quantity, M, quantity in the free market. All right, so that's at that point. So the airline industry is buying these aircraft, the Boeing 737 MAX, at a particular price of PM, a particular quantity of QM. But over time, as we saw in that Wikipedia page, there were 2 airline crashes within about less than a year, 2 years between each other. And so knowledge started to come out that there were issues with these planes. Perhaps initially Boeing was denying it, but now we're at the point through investigation that we're seeing that Boeing knew that there was problems and they allocated and provided these aircraft anyway to society. If a consumer has knowledge of the defects, of course, they're not going to demand this aircraft. They're going to demand less of it. So if there's more perfect information or more symmetrical information provided to the consumer, we would expect less demand for the aircraft. So that gives us a second demand curve here. Maybe I'll use a slightly different blue color. So here we have D2. And D2 can be equal to the marginal social benefit. And that social benefit is derived from more information provided to the consumer. Marginal social benefit with symmetric information. Okay, so D1 asymmetric information, D2 with symmetric information. Perfect. Okay, then we have a new equilibrium set there. We're going to go ahead and illustrate that. And that provides us with an optimal price and an optimal quantity of these aircraft being to society, provided to society. Society obviously wants less of these aircraft that are defective in the air. And we can also highlight how this asymmetric information leads to, at QM, here we can see the marginal social cost of these defective aircraft being greater than the social benefits derived to society. So that creates a welfare loss. And we can shade in that area. Here we have that welfare loss due to the asymmetric information that's damaging the airline industry and costing the lives of over 300 people. A welfare loss where we can see at QM, marginal social cost is greater than marginal social benefit. There's an overallocation of resources to the production of this particular good, the Boeing 737 MAX. Okay. Social optimum would be achieved where MSC equals MSB if more information is provided to the consumer. More information provided to the consumer leads to reduced demand, it leads to a reduction in price, and a reduction in the quantity being supplied and demanded to society. We can also see in this model, we can also highlight how Boeing, by providing these defective aircraft, knowingly providing these defective aircraft, was able to gain additional producer surplus. That additional producer surplus is this area here. That additional producer surplus and profit is going to Boeing at the cost of providing these defective airlines and leading to all these spillover impacts to society. So that should be reduced. If we're able to provide more information to society, you're not going to get that producer surplus going to Boeing. All right, so we can mark that as producer surplus gained due to asymmetric information. Okay, so there's another model. Monopoly, we've linked it to asymmetric information. Okay, what's the solution? You need a strong government body, a regulatory body that's purely independent, not influenced by lobbying, that's really taking a careful look at the quality of this aircraft and determining whether they're good for society or not. If they're not good, don't put the seal of approval on it. This is complex, right? Boeing, with its super normal profit, it's going to take portions of their supernormal profit and try to corrupt and lobby government officials. Here we can see political contributions, federal contracts, advocacy. 2008, 2009, Boeing was second on the list of top 100 U.S. federal contractors, with contracts totaling $222 billion. There's a strong interdependence between the U.S. government and Boeing. And 23 billion respectively. Between 1995 and early 2021, the company agreed to pay 4.3 billion to settle 84 instances of misconduct, including $650 million in 2006 in relation to illegal hiring of government officials and improper use of proprietary information. Illegal hiring of government officials means that there's a revolving door between politicians working in the public sector and then getting hired in the private sector. Because of their government contacts, they get hired by Boeing, and they're able to ensure that Boeing gets certain government contracts. So there's a revolving door. We can just say it, corruption between the two entities, and that's going to reduce the ability of the government to properly regulate Boeing as a monopoly. The regulatory body in the United States for Boeing and the airline industry is the Federal Aviation Administration. It's a U.S. federal government agency with the U.S. Department of Transportation, which regulates civil aviation in the United States and surrounding international waters. But if we look at the criticisms of the FAA, there's a conflicting role. There's a conflict of interest here. The FAA has been cited as an example of regulatory capture in which the airline industry openly dictates, which is just a crazy idea, to its regulators. So basically, the airline industry, Boeing, is telling the regulators what the rules should be for themselves, in which the airline industry openly dictates to its regulators its governing rules, arranging for not only beneficial regulation to these firms like Boeing, but placing key people to head these regulators. Retired NASA Office of Inspector General Senior Special Agent Joseph Gunthens, who used to be a special agent with the Office of Inspector General for the Department of Transportation and with the FAA Security, is one of the most outspoken critics of the FAA. And it just goes on and on and on. So a government solution is government regulation, but if the government regulation is corrupted, then you're going to get really, really bad outcomes. You're going to get more market failure. So there's a complete failure on the regulatory side and on the private sector side and on the government side. Okay. So that's it. So if you have any questions, you can comment those questions below. Don't forget to subscribe and to like, and I'll try to keep creating some more videos regarding some other evaluative points within the context of theory of the firm. Thank you so much, and that's it.